Well, good. I'll be the floor, and by the time I'm done,
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sam Jaworski. I'm the current chair of the Adult Learning Committee at the United Center for Jewish Education. On behalf of CJE and the Festival of Jewish Literature, I'm delighted to welcome you all here tonight. Obviously, we were smart. We would have planned this in February. Tonight's event is part of Baltimore's 11th day Festival of Jewish Literature. You know where this is going on, which is a community-wide celebration of books, writers, and the power of literature to inform, educate, and entertain. The festival is being sponsored by Ivy Bookshop, they're out there, and Jane Moore Magazine, who both share a commitment to the written word. We also want to give special thanks to Rabbi Mark G. Lowe Center for Lifelong Learning at Bethel for hosting us this evening. The festival, which includes events for both adults and children, has been taking place in venues all over Baltimore, including the Gordon Center, Peter Jack Day School, the Jewish Museum, the Ivy Bookshop, the Church of the Redeemer, Center Stage, Friends of the Bethel Library, and various synagogues, including Chizuk Luna, Walter Hebrew, Har Sinai, Bethel, and Moses Montefiore on Shea. But wait, there are still more events left, and it's not supposed to snow anymore. So if you want to learn more about the remaining events, there's information in the back. You can also go to our website, www.festivalofjewishliterature.org. While tonight's event comes towards the end of this literature festival, the reading only starts, and the project is going to continue throughout the year. We're calling it On the Same Page, and the goal is to have as much of the community read the same book, and participate in book crossing, and book discussions, and events, book clubs, and other groups. We even have mini grants that are local book clubs and other groups to develop their own programming around this book. So if you'd like to apply for the grant or other book clubs or groups with 500 people that are running here, to register, tell them, and maybe there's enough for everyone, but sign up early. And if you're interested, where's Zena? There we go, that's Zena. Zena Siegel is the new director of adult learning at the CJE. You can find her afterwards to talk about these programs and mini grants if you're interested. So, by now you know what book we're talking about. Dara Horn's latest book, Eternal Life. There were lots of good books out there to choose from, and we had a whole committee to debate the pros and cons. I got to read more books in the month that I've read since college, so already a successful program. And I just want to thank them, those who are here, for their valuable insight. In particular, I want to thank Judy Meltzer and Gail Lipsitz, who actually did all the work and I'm here talking. Some of you have already read the book, Eternal Life, and you've come here tonight to learn more about the book directly from the author. Those who have not will hopefully be inspired tonight to read the book and discuss it with others. And I look forward to our community exploring the powerful Jewish themes in this novel in various ways over the upcoming months. So, without further ado, it's my honor to introduce Dara Horn, author of 4 previous novels, All Other Nights, The World to Come, In the Image, and A Guide for the Perplexed, as well as various short stories. Dara Horn is one of Grant Magazine's best young American novelists. Recognized as a master storyteller, she has been awarded 2 National Jewish Book Awards, the Reform Judaism Fiction Prize, and the Harold U. Ribolo Prize, among others. The New York Times Book Review has selected several of her books as editor's choices, with a PhD in comparative literature from Harvard, where she is a visiting professor of Jewish studies. This one, Dr. Horn, draws from her extensive knowledge of and deep appreciation for Jewish history, literature, Hebrew, and Yiddish in her works. She has also taught Jewish literature and Israeli history at Sarah Lawrence College and City University of New York. Dara Horn is not only an outstanding scholar and author, she is also a strong voice in the American Jewish community during these challenging times, as reflected in her recent articles in the New York Times and Smithsonian Magazine. Please join me in giving a warm welcome on this cold day to Dara Horn.
Can I maybe better this afternoon?
Yeah.
Is this okay?
Yeah, I mean,
Cool. Let's do this. This works?
Yeah.
Awesome.
With the mic.
you need it with the mic, you've got some.
Some people
Is there an echo back there?
Yeah, there's something.
Okay.
Or we could all move up forward and then you wouldn't need it. There's a lot of chairs here.
Should we do that?
Yeah.
It's your call.
So.
Is this better?
Yes.
Oh, some people say no, some people say yes.
There's no clarity.
It is on.
Is there an AV person?
If I'm really loud, does that work?
Yeah. No, everyone should just scoot in.
Come forward.
Yeah. There you go.
So everybody sits like,
Right.
yeah, if you move a little bit here, it will be
You can even stand down there.
yeah, it's a lot
We
of,
can all be friends.
yeah, it's like
Like,
small, cozy
like,
meeting.
Why don't I stand out here? Can I be here and we can be friends? Is that better? Is that better? Let's like be friends. Thank you all for being my friends and for coming on this extremely unpleasant evening. And I'm really, really honored that you're here. I feel like everyone made a very special effort to be here this evening because this wasn't fun to get here. So thank you so much for coming. And I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you to everybody at CJE for inviting me and other people involved in having me come. You heard a little bit about me in this lovely introduction, which made me sound very professional. But you didn't hear the most salient fact of my personal life, which is that in addition to writing these books, I'm also the mother of a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, which means that no one in my house ever listens to anything I have to say ever. So in addition to me being so thrilled that you all came out in this horrible weather, I'm also like, just so grateful, like, wow, I'm in a room full of people who like are willing to listen to what I have to say. Like, this never happens to me at home. So thank you in advance for listening to what I have to say, because like I said, this is an unfamiliar experience to me in my house. So my new book, which I left up there, but you all know what it looks like, I guess. My new book is called Eternal Life, and this book is about a woman who can't die. This is not a very original idea. Right? We all have heard of stories like Talk Everlasting or The Highlander or, the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? I mean, stories about people who are immortal or are on a quest for immortality. This is like this, in a way, it's literature's oldest plot, right? These are stories that are literature is really in many ways always about defeating death. Right? Like every story, Harry Potter, thank you. Every story is in some way about like this battle between us and our mortality. But if you look at those stories of immortal characters, you might notice what I noticed, which is that they are almost never about fertile women. I started like wondering why. How many people here have heard the classic Mel Brooks comedy routine about the 2,000-year-old man? Okay, a lot of people. For anybody who's not familiar with it, this is this comedy classic from over 50 years ago about an old Jewish guy, a very old Jewish guy, whose 2,000 years of life have led him to conclude that the most amazing thing ever invented is saran wrap. But well, so my book is not about the 2,000-year-old man. It's about someone with slightly more life experience, the 2,000-year-old mom. So unlike the 2,000-year-old mom, unlike the 2,000-year-old man, the 2,000-year-old mom has been really, really busy. Right? Like she almost can't even remember the first 1,500 years. My main character has been married about 45 times. She's had hundreds and hundreds of children. She's spent centuries pregnant and nursing. She's faced off with every possible type of child. She has dealt with hundreds of teenage sons and daughters telling her that she is an idiot who is ruining their lives. And of course she has gone through all of that while listening to every random stranger say to her, nostalgically, enjoy them. It goes by so fast. The 2,000-year-old mom disagrees. Actually, she's been driven so nuts that by the 21st century, she winds up in a psychiatrist's office. Of course, she has already tried the rebbes, the barber surgeons, the alchemists, the healers, the sages, the ancient high priests. When the psychiatrist asks her that clinical question, do you ever have thoughts of killing yourself? She says, all the time, but it's just a fantasy. In this book, there's also one other person who is in the same situation as my immortal main character. And perhaps some of you have had some experience like this at some point in your lives. You know that bad high school boyfriend or girlfriend who never gets the hint, never goes away, never leaves you alone? Imagine if they really never went away. And, they're just kind of following you around, trying to get back together with you, hoping you'll change your mind for thousands of years. So whether this is an epic tale of true love or an epic tale of stalking kind of depends on your point of view. And the more I thought about the prospect of immortality from a woman's perspective, the more clearly I saw the difference between the 2,000-year-old man and the 2,000-year-old mom. And it had to do with how women have historically been expected to shape their lives around their obligations to other people. And it made me wonder, what would it really be like to go through all of that again and again and again with some middle-aged kid always moving back into your basement? And that question kind of turned this book into a comedy and a tragedy all at the same time. My previous novels were about things like art heists and Civil War spies. So as you might suspect, I'm not a very autobiographical writer. And you might think that a book about an immortal woman is not very autobiographical either, but actually my immortal character and I have a lot in common. I do not have 400 children, but I do have 4, which kind of feels the same. And in a larger family like mine, time doesn't really pass, it just sort of repeats. It's like you make lunch, and you make lunch, and you make lunch, and you make lunch, and you make lunch, like thousands of times for decades. And parents often say that, raising children goes by so fast, but after 10 and a half continuous years of changing diapers, that was just not my personal experience. I'm going to be the tooth fairy, until my own teeth start to fall out. And I dedicated this book to my own parents and their 14 grandchildren, at least 8 of whom are eating dinner in their house on any given night, including tonight, because I'm here. And I once actually asked my mother whether it was true what people always say about how raising children, how it goes by so fast. And my mother just looked at me like I was stupid and said, it's interminable. A few years ago, I started noticing news stories about Silicon Valley companies that were researching what they call life extension, basically, as one executive put it, to solve the problem of death. So some of this is like this classic Ponce de Leon quest for the fountain of youth. These are people who are collecting blood samples from elderly people to see what it is that's making them live so long, or conversely, some people, collecting blood samples from young people and injecting it into themselves in this sort of vampire process. There's people who are injecting themselves with their own stem cells to reverse their own aging, and there's an enormous amount of investment in this. And if all of this results in some amazing breakthrough in Alzheimer's research, I think we can all be grateful to these, Silicon Valley billionaires who thought they were going to live forever. But when you read interviews with the people funding this research, you see that this is not all about, as they say, healthy aging. I read many interviews with people like Peter Thiel, who were waxing eloquent about the potential for human immortality. And what was amazing to me was that all of these interviews assumed that living forever was something that everyone ought to want. This seemed to me like a particularly American desire, because American culture is very much based on the premise that only new things matter and the past is irrelevant. So why not keep on pursuing happiness and never worry about what you leave behind? And in a sense, we can sort of say this is a trivial way of looking at the world, but it's also the foundation of everything we think about when we think about American opportunity. right? Because the whole sort of founding legend of this culture in this country is that it doesn't matter where you come from, right? It doesn't matter who your parents are, it doesn't matter what your background is, what matters is what you do with the opportunities this country gives you. Of course, that's what we call the American dream. But this also seems to me exactly like the opposite view of time from the one that I grew up with in the Jewish community, right? Because in Judaism, you have this whole belief system that's based on exactly the opposite. It's based on the assumption of a deep historical consciousness. And if you think about the founding legend of this American dream, compare that for a moment with one of our founding legends in the Jewish community, which is the idea we find in the Midrash that when God gave the Torah to the Israelites at Mount Sinai, it wasn't just that generation of Israelites who were present to receive the Torah, but all of their descendants were also physically present, standing at Sinai to receive the Torah from God. Well, if you think about that story, it's actually the opposite of the American dream. Because what that story is saying is actually it does matter who your parents are, who your grandparents are, who your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents are. And in fact, the most important thing in your life happened thousands of years before you were born, and there is nothing you can do about it. So this is really a very, very different view of time. And I think that if you think about this seriously, you realize that the entire belief system of Judaism is based on the assumption of a deep historical consciousness, which is the idea that past events are constantly reverberating through the present, that your life is not merely yours alone, but that you're part of this vast intergenerational chain of sharing what it means to be human, and that a major purpose of our lives is to ensure that that meaning survives us. And it's in fact this alternative view of time that made me a writer in the first place, because my real subject as a writer is time. Ever since I was a child, I've been very obsessed with time and deeply troubled by how days disappear. When I was a little girl, I would get into bed at the end of the day, and I would think about the day, and I would always have this thought before I went to sleep, which was, this day that just ended, where did it go? And I was so troubled by this, but that I shared it with my best friend. This is when I was about 6 or 7 years old. My best friend, who I should add is now also a writer and a novelist. Her name is Elif Batuman. She's a staff writer at The New Yorker. So I know how to pick them. And she and I were best friends even from when we were 6. And I told her about how troubled I was by this. And she told me, oh, that's not a problem. I know how to fix that. And she said she had just read in a children's magazine about something called a time capsule. She says, all you need to do is get a shoebox and put stuff in it from the day and bury it for future generations to discover. So we decided that we were going to do this together. And every time we would get together to play our elaborate games about traveling through outer space, we would write down everything that happened in the game and put those papers into the shoebox that we were going to then bury for future generations to discover. So unsurprisingly, future generations were not at all interested in our adventures on other planets. But this really made me into a writer in the sense that I was always keeping these journals, and it became something that I became very obsessed with. Was my origins as a writer really were from this desire not to tell a story or to make something up, but to record. And it was all in this effort to preserve these disappearing days, which I think is a sensation. Maybe not all of us felt that when we were 7 every day lying in bed, but I think probably all of us feel it one time or another in our mortal lives. As I got older, I realized that I was very fortunate to have been born into this particular tradition in Judaism, because in fact, I realized that Judaism is actually a kind of technology that's designed to solve this problem of being trapped in linear time. Because this is not a tradition that sees time as linear. Instead, we believe that the past is always here, that there's this existential past that is always part of the present, right? You see yourself as if you personally came out of Egypt. You see yourself as if you were personally standing at Sinai. And the first time I went to Jerusalem with my family when I was a child, I got to actually see where days go when they disappear. They're underground. In Jerusalem's Old City, and I'm sure many of you have been to this place. There's a place where you can walk down a flight of stairs and you get to the street level from the Roman period. It's like an underground shopping arcade. It's called the Cardo, right, which is the north-south street that was built during the Roman period. But it was amazing to me that like here at the top of the staircase I'm in now, and then at the bottom of the staircase I'm in then. And the city itself is in fact a kind of what archaeologists call a tell, right? It's an archaeological site with physical layers built on top of each other of past civilization, all of those disappeared days lying on top of each other underneath our feet. As I got older, I understood that people have these layers too, that we all have these vanished days within us, even if we don't know it. It's a biological fact that all of us are made out of dead people, right? Every one of your genes is something you have inherited from one of your dead ancestors. But it is also emotionally true, regardless of who our biological ancestors are, that the way that we see and respond to our world is shaped by the people around us and the people who raised and taught us and the people who came before us. So obviously that's our parents and our teachers, but also so many other people who shape our lives. Whether it's an influence as dramatic as like an EMT who saves you from death, or as apparently trivial as like the friend who introduced you to your favorite band. I'd like everyone here to think for a moment of a person in your life who made you interested in something that matters to you now. So think of something in your life that is a hugely important part of your life. It can be something as serious as a religious commitment or as seemingly trivial as, a passion for opera, right? Whatever, something that's moving and meaningful and important part of your life that you can't imagine your life without. Now think about who the person was in your life who gave you that. And it may be more than one person, but there was probably someone in your life who got you excited about that thing, whatever it is, and who in a sense you can trace your passion for that thing to that person. Now, someone in that person's life gave them that too. And maybe someone you didn't know. Someone who was their parent, their teacher, their friend, their neighbor, whoever it was, someone in their life gave that to them. Now think about that person. Someone in their life gave that to them. So you see that we don't only have a biological inheritance that's just in our bodies and our genes. We are all the heirs to this spiritual legacy that goes back to many, many people that we have never met or known before. And that is the real timeless feature of the 2,000-year-old mom, is that she knows that her life is not only hers. This book is a very contemporary story. The plot hinges on things like gene therapy and a Bitcoin mining rig. Yes, I wrote about Bitcoin before it was cool, but I was not smart enough to invest in Bitcoin before it was cool. Still upset about that. But so this is like a very kind of like, contemporary story on all these topical things. But my main characters get into this situation because of a vow they took in the Beit HaMikdash, in the ancient temple in Jerusalem, during the time of the Roman occupation of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, my main characters were living in the most sophisticated empire in the world, just like we are now. And I think that situation of being in a high-tech empire that thinks it's invincible is something that's very familiar to us today. But of course, the Jewish religion at that time was very, very different. As many of you know, Judaism at that time, at the time while the temple was standing, was very much centered on that temple. It was centered on this sacrificial cult at this ancient temple in Jerusalem, where the preferred method of winning divine favor was to slaughter lots of goats. And when I talk about this book at Barnes & Noble, I usually leave it there. But for you, I will admit that the animal sacrifices in the temple are something that I think about much more than any normal person should. And there's a very specific reason for this. Ever since I was 12 years old, I was trained as a Torah reader. So I'm the person who chants the Torah at the services. And I did this from when I was 12. I got a job in my family's congregation doing this for the children's congregation. So I was doing this every week in the children's congregation. And so because of that, I'm very familiar with this yearly cycle of Torah readings. And a lot of us feel that, we are familiar with the Torah, there's Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the stories about the patriarchs and matriarchs, and then of course there's the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and I gotta tell you, once you get past Mount Sinai, there's just a lot of Torah portions that are just about killing lots of goats and sheep, rams, bulls. Yeah, there's just a lot, and I know all of the details about like how many goats to kill and when. So, and at one point I had so much sympathy for these goats that I wrote an elegy for the goats entitled "The Jewish Goat's Lament," which I will share with you now. I can't believe I'm doing this. Okay, it goes like this: one little goat, repeat it now and learn by rote. To master all of Jewish lore, stand not on 1 foot, but on 4. The Torah teaches, and I quote, "You got a problem? Kill a goat. We goats take credit for your sins. Just sacrifice us half a hin of fine meal flour, never fear. Then all your sins will disappear. Mincha, Mariv, Shavuot, each day you kill another goat. For sacrificial goat distinction, our species never almost reached extinction. Oh, why should we pay with our lives for your unkoshered plates and knives? Oh, why condemn the goats to death? Was it our beards, our bad goat breath? Leviticus does not explain why it demands that goats be slain. But then your temple was destroyed, and that day goats were overjoyed." So we can laugh about this now, but this really was the center of our ancestors' lives. This really was their connection to God, and it was not a metaphor. There was nothing abstract about this. There was nothing intellectual about this, a whole scholarly idea of inquiry and of discussion, and none of that has anything to do with this. This is just visceral, physical, bloody. It requires a physical presence in one essential place chosen by God. There's no soul, there's no ideas, there's no afterlife. This is like we're killing a goat. So, after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and also destroyed the temple in the year 70 CE, Judaism itself really should have died too. But before this destruction, a sage named Yochanan ben Zakkai, and this is a real historical figure, but who I made into a character in the book. So if you read the book, you'll meet this person in my fictional reimagining of him. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai looked around and saw the city sieged by the Romans. There's Jewish zealots who are fighting the Romans who aren't even letting anyone out of the city because they consider that like surrendering. They want to fight to the last man. He's thinking, well, what can I do about this situation? He sees the future. He sees that the temple's going to be destroyed. There's going to be nothing left. He has himself smuggled out of the city in a coffin. And his disciples carry him in this coffin out of the city, because they did allow people to be removed, important people to be removed from the city for burial. Not everyone, but important people like him. So he fakes his own death. He has himself carried out of the city, and he has himself brought to the headquarters of the Roman general Vespasian. This is the person who's in charge of putting down this Jewish revolt against Rome. So he's brought into the headquarters of Vespasian, and he then pops out of the coffin and says to the Roman Emperor Vespasian, the Roman general Vespasian, Vivat Imperator, which means, long live the emperor. Now, General Vespasian, in addition to being a little weirded out that this guy just popped out of a coffin, says, I should also have you executed for disrespecting me because I am not the emperor. 2 minutes later, a messenger comes into Vespasian's headquarters and says, General Vespasian, we've just received an urgent message from Rome. Nero has died. You are being called back to Rome to become the emperor. So at this point, Vespasian looks at this guy who popped out of the coffin and says, what can I do for you? And you might think at that moment that Yochanan might have said, can we lift the siege on Jerusalem? Can we not destroy the city? Can we not destroy the temple? No, he says instead, can I set up a school for Torah scholars in this beach town that no one's ever heard of? Vespasian's like, sure, no problem. And he goes off to Rome, becomes the emperor. His son Titus takes over, crushing the revolt, destroys the temple. Fast forward a little bit, people go into exile for 2,000 years, and we're sitting here in Baltimore, Maryland. So what I think is amazing about this moment is that During this moment where Yochanan makes this choice of what he wants to save, this is essentially a moment where both Yochanan and Judaism fake their own deaths in order to survive this cataclysm. Instead of dying, this religion itself was transformed into what I would call the world's first virtual reality system, where the physical temple service is replaced with Torah study, with prayer, with ethical deeds, and only virtual dead goats. And I think you don't have to believe in anything supernatural to see that there's something extremely unlikely about the survival of Jewish civilization from ancient times until now. And I am not the only person who has ever thought that. In 1898, Mark Twain wrote an essay in Harper's Magazine called Concerning the Jews. And at the end of that essay, he talks about all the ancient civilizations that have risen and fallen, and he says, the Egyptians had this magnificent empire and now it's become dust. He says the Babylonians no longer walk the earth. Who even remembers who the Parthians are anymore? The Persians have come and gone. The Greeks and the Romans are reduced to shells of their former selves. He says only the Jews remain. What is the secret of their immortality? Now, of course, the traditional answer to this is the contract with God, embodied in the Torah. I would like to add a layer to that explanation, which is the idea of resilience. In the book of Genesis, we have the introduction of there's a certain image that appears in the book of Genesis in the Garden of Eden. It's called the Tree of Life. We think that of Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden, and mostly what we remember from that story is that it's because they ate from this tree of knowledge of good and evil. If you read that story, that's not why God expels them from the Garden of Eden. God expels them from the Garden of Eden because God says, they ate from this tree of knowledge of good and evil. What if they now go and eat from the tree of life and live forever? So then God expels Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden and guards the tree of life with something that the text calls cheruvim. In English, it's like cherubim, but they're not like fat babies like they are in Christian art. They're more like, but it's some sort of angelic creature with wings, which is how you end up with these fat winged babies in Christian art. So these cheruvim are protecting this tree of life. And then that means that people no longer have access to this tree of life. In the book of Exodus, that image appears again. In the Torah portion where it describes how the children of Israel are supposed to make this mishkan, this portable tabernacle in the desert. It also describes how they're supposed to build the Ark of the Covenant to keep the tablets of the law. And it tells how many cubits they're supposed to make it, etc. And then it says, when you make this Ark of the Covenant, you put on the top of the Ark of the Covenant 2 cheruvim with their wings stretching over the Ark of the Covenant. So you see that the tree of life now has been replaced. It is no longer a physical tree offering personal immortality. It has now been transformed into a book offering national immortality. An everlasting story which, as Mark Twain pointed out, we are still participating in today. I think that the story of Yochanan ben Zakkai faking his own death to create a new life for the Jewish people really required him to take a chance on something that could very easily have failed, to change what people had always done and believed, and take the risk of transforming it into something new. I think in times of tragedy, we often look for sources of hope and resilience. Resilience is like a very hot topic now in educational psychology. We hear today a lot about what educational psychologists call grit, right? Which is like this idea of training kids to have the stamina to push through challenges. But I'd like everyone to think for a moment of a time when you made it through something in your own life that was difficult or even devastating. Not just something that was a challenge, but something where you felt that the entire foundations of your life had been pulled away. Now, think of how you moved through that experience. The steps that you took, the choices that you made, the turning points. I'm sure that you had plenty of grit when you needed it, but I'm also sure that you had two other things that were even more important. One is that you changed. You did not come out of that experience the same person as when you went in. You had the ability to change who you were. And the second thing is that you didn't do it alone. Someone or something, or the memory of someone or something, helped you through it. This is very much what happened to the Jewish people after the destruction of the temple. First, we changed. We went from being a goat-killing cult to being the people of the book. But we also had someone who helped us through it. I actually don't mean God, but rather God's agents here on earth, Jewish mothers. And so in a sense, what I've done in this novel is I have basically taken that extremely unlikely situation of this people that should not have lasted as long as it had and has gone through this sort of supernatural survival. And I basically just turned that experience into a person, or rather two people who have very different ideas about what it means to live forever. My main character in this novel is very much a failure as a parent, because her 56-year-old son has moved back into her basement, which is kind of every parent's nightmare. She also raises hundreds and hundreds of children who she knows she's going to outlive, which is, of course, every parent's much bigger nightmare, but I think that it also captures the reality of everyone's limits. Whether or not we have children, the only thing that we can give to people who will follow us in this world is a past to build a future with. What will we take from the world that came before us, and what will we give to the world that comes after us? Ultimately, these are not parenting questions or questions about teaching or religion or creativity. They're really just questions about the purpose of being alive. I hope you will enjoy this book, even if your years of being the Tooth Fairy are somewhat more limited than mine. And for the Peter Thiels of the world, I offer one piece of undying advice, which is always leave the party while you're still having fun. Thank you so much for listening, because that never happens in my house.
If we have any questions in our small, intimate party.
Yes, this is like our book club discussion.
So I totally missed your point.
Okay.
No, I got your point here. And I'm going to reread the book because I looked at it as a love story.
It is.
An absolute love story. I didn't look at him as being a demon and a stalker. I looked at him as just kind of totally not giving up, and her saying, "You did what?" So that his choice in this love story, where he thinks he's being so wonderful, is what said, "You did what?" And he's constantly trying to get her approval.
You didn't misunderstand.
Good.
Yeah, so the question is, it's like she says, I didn't read this as a story about stalking, I read this as an epic love story. It is absolutely an epic love story, right? I mean, that's why I said, it sort of depends on your point of view, whether you think this is stalking, whether you think this is a love story, and she goes back and forth with it, right? This is the kind of relationship, like, if you had to check a box on Facebook, it would be, it's complicated. And I will tell you that this is something that's not in the book, but it's something that was going through my mind as I was writing it. Because I'm always thinking, everything I think is like filtered through this like Torah filter. And the book, the Song of Songs, or the Tanakh filter, the Song of Songs is, this love story, and it's always about one person pursuing the other, and I searched for her, and I searched for her, and I couldn't find her. And the rabbis interpret this story as being this romance between God and the people of Israel. And I was always so bothered by that idea, because first of all, it's a very sort of erotic physical poem, but also because I'm like, if it's a romance between God and the people of Israel, like, it's kind of a sadomasochistic romance. It's sort of this like a rocky relationship. And I'm not even talking about now, I'm talking about like in the Torah, in the Tanakh, I mean, there's a lot of like, lover spats, shall we say, I hate you so much. I mean, if you read any of the Haftorahs, the prophets, they're always like, I cast you out and then I bring you back again, right? I mean, this is a very stormy relationship. And I was trying to capture that idea.
Well, you did.
Yes, so thank you. Yes?
You also make 2 points in the book that struck me as being appropriately Silicon Valley critical. One is that love is a function of affinity. And the second is reboots don't work. they repeat the same experience. And I'm wondering if that was something that you were consciously packing the book with, because Barbara Ehrenreich's new book, Natural Causes, has a very impassioned condemnation of a great many aspects of the themes you explored from her physical science perspective.
So, to answer your question, it's like, am I packing the book with these ideas? Well, regardless of those particular ideas, I'm never packing books with ideas because I don't plan my books in advance at all. I'm writing them like the way you're reading them. Like, I want to know what happens next, and then it's like what emerges is what emerges. These are ideas I see, writing the books is a way of me thinking through these ideas. And so then after the book is done, I can like write an essay about the concept, or then I kind of know what to. So actually, and I did a piece for the New York Times about the about immortality, and after this book came out, because I had thought through it during writing the book, and it was about exactly that idea that if people lived forever, there would be no need for love. And I didn't quite put it exactly that way in the piece, but. It was about how the question of why, and this is, I don't think I quite put it this way in the New York Times piece, but that if you think about like, why do we love people? Why do we love someone other than just, sexual chemistry, companionship? Why do we want to commit to another person? Like, and not everybody wants this, but why do most people want to have long-term relationships in their lives, even if it's not a romantic relationship, even if it's with a child or a long-term friendship or whatever. Why do we value those long-term relationships? Why is that the core of who we are so deeply, those relationships? And I think it's that it's somewhere in your mind, even if it's not conscious, you know that at some point in your life you're going to need someone, or that other person is going to need someone. And you would never need someone if you were immortal, right? And in a sense, love is about, and intimacy is based on the idea of vulnerability, right? That you are totally vulnerable and you would not be vulnerable if you were immortal. So in that sense, so yes, that was something that I was definitely thinking about, not so articulately as I was writing the book. There was the second part of your question, though. I can't remember what it was.
The second part was that the passion for immortality in the Silicon Valley world is essentially reboot.
Yes, like everything can be fixed.
I'll work it out with you.
Well, I mean, Yochanan ben Zakkai that was like a reboot of Judaism, right? It's like and there's many points in the book where our main character, she notices this about her children, is that they keep trying to turn things into metaphors, right? So it's like, like her son who's the deadbeat is like, he's mining Bitcoins in her basement. So it's like, he's like turning physical currency into virtual currency, like blowing all his money on this like Bitcoin mining rig, right? And so it's like, she's like, why do my kids always do this? Like everything, they're always like turning normal things into metaphors. And she's actually very angry at Yochanan ben Zakkai, he's her oldest son. He's sort of the reason for the whole plot of the book. And she's angry at him because she's like, you took something real and you turned it into a metaphor, and that's how she sees it. Yes?
I thought it was interesting what you said about American culture wanting everything to be new versus Jewish culture where we have a reverence for the past. I have this discussion with my students all the time about plagiarism. They never want to give credit to the person who said it. They think that it makes it better to pass it off as their own. And I said, I always say to them, in my culture, it makes what you say better if you say it in the name of the person who said it, b'shem amro.
Yes.
And but you always think it's better if you can claim novelty for it, if you can claim that it's something new. It seems to be like built into American culture that it's better if you don't say it in the name of the person that said it.
Yes. Well, and it's built into Jewish culture that what is most valued is not how original you are, but how unoriginal you are.
How unoriginal.
Right? No, really, like how well you build on older sources is like this. Yeah.
The more you can give credit to the
Yes.
source, the better it is.
And that's actually something that really motivated me as a novelist too, because when I started writing these novels, this is my 5th book, and all my books sort of deal with Jewish culture in this kind of way, and the reason I started writing these novels was because I was studying Hebrew and Yiddish literature. So my doctorate is in Yiddish and Hebrew literature. I was just like really jealous of these writers. I was not jealous of their wives because they all had horrible, horrible lives. But I was jealous of their language because when they were writing in these Jewish languages, they were constantly making references to these ancient sources, and it's like very natural. And the truth is, like, all languages have this archaeology of belief that's built into them, right? That you don't even hear as a native speaker, right? Like in English, when you say to somebody, oh, it'll happen for better or for worse, like you're not like, oh, I'm quoting the Anglican marriage ceremony, right? But you are, right? Or you say to somebody, go the extra mile, you're not like, oh, I'm quoting the Gospels, but like you are. That's from, Jesus tells his disciples, I'm gonna go 1 mile beyond you. So, I mean, it's like every time someone sneezes, this like archaeology of belief rises to the surface in a language. So in Jewish languages, like in Yiddish and Hebrew, and there actually are 20 Jewish languages over the course of world history, all of those references are from the Torah and the Tanakh and the Talmud and the Siddur and this like sort of vast edifice of thoughts. And I just thought, like, well, wouldn't it be cool if we had that in English? Right? Like, if I could write in English as though English were a Jewish language. And what I mean by that is not like writing books with lots of words in italics, but like, writing books where like the references and the sort of...
And the more you have, the better you are.
Yes, well, those references were like drawn from these ancient texts, but like, in a way that was accessible to any English language reader, so, yes.
When you asked that question before, I wasn't thinking the way you were thinking. I was thinking that the human personality doesn't want to be alone. We want companionship. And the being alone can be very despairing. If we look at the suicide rate, who was it? It was always the highest was of single men, which was always the epitome of, wow, you could be a single guy, you have the whole thing on, you have the whole world. And yet there was the highest suicide rate. That it was a question of not wanting to be alone, to be able to share your thoughts, your feelings, the sense of companionship. And what you're saying, when I was teaching the Psalms, it was the kids couldn't understand why anybody would want to go and put David's name to what they were writing in later years. And they said the credit rating, you don't do anything by yourself, even if your parents think you do. The reality is you're doing something because someone has given you a path, whether it was a negative path or a positive path. So that there's always, you didn't just pop up. There was something that came in and around you, all the different influences, and you need to give credit to those influences.
Yes, and I think that, right, what you said about there's this, people don't want to be alone. And in a sense, what being part of like, or being aware of a cultural tradition does is it makes you aware that you aren't alone, right? Even if you are alone in space, you are not alone in time, because there are all these people before you who are always there, right, speaking over your shoulder, right? And I feel like I'm always hearing those people, even if maybe not everyone is always listening to those people. I'm always listening to those people. Yes.
So I read this book in the summer, and it's a little bit, parts of it are a little bit vague.
I wrote it a year ago, so I don't know. You read it more recently
One
than I.
thing I really remember was feeling, unlike in your other books, kind of unmoored and not always sure where and when things were taking place, and I was uncomfortable at times, like where are we here, and how old is Rachel here, and I kept sort of grasping. It's like free floating in space, and trying to grab onto something and anchor myself. Did you want to create that, or am I missing? Did you want readers to react that way?
Well, I was sort of, in a sense, like, all my books are sort of dealing with this question of, like, the way the past lives in the present, right? And in this book, I wanted, with each of my books, I sort of set myself a goal, not like, this is what I'm going to accomplish, but I should say a challenge, like, and I mean this just from, like, an artistic point of view. I try to do something that I haven't done in previous books, in each of my books, and you know, it's like a challenge, like, oh, I've never succeeded in doing X before, I'm gonna try to do that, right? Like, and so with this book, I felt like I had always written these books where like, they were kind of these like elaborate constructions where, you know, there was like story A, which happens in 2012, but then there's like story B that happens in like the 12th century, and then there's like story C that happens in the night, you know, and then they would like alternate, and there'd be like many people telling different stories, and I was just like, I don't know if I could do it where it was just like one person. And I have another book where I have from one person's point of view, but I was like, could I still do this? Like, I basically wanted to kind of streamline that. And so have that same story that was taking place on multiple levels at multiple times, but make it just one person. Right? And so it's all filtered through this one person instead of sort of these different people who are somehow connected to each other, which is a lot of my previous books do. I wanted to make it one person. And so one of the things that was, you know, and so when I sort of thought of this idea, I thought like, you know, well, there's sort of like the boring way to do that, at least in my opinion, would be the boring way to do that would be to kind of like march through this lady's life, you know, where it's like, so you're like on this like carousel of progress where you're like, well, here we are in the 12th century, you know, and oh, here we come, here's the Crusades, and like, you know, and like I didn't want to do this like, you know, this is your life carousel of progress. Also, the reason I didn't want to do that, first of all, is that it was boring, but also because that's not how we experience our lives, right? I mean, our lives are a lot shorter than hers, but we still have like a history, but like when you look back at your life, however old you are, you don't think about like, well, first I was born, and then I moved to this city, and then my sister got sick, and then that's when I started kindergarten, and then, like, you don't think of your life that way. You remember the parts of your life when they are brought to you in the present. You know, like you go to visit someone's house and you smell something, and that smell reminds you of something, you know, like your mother's perfume or something. You know what I mean? It's something like that. Like we experience our past not in this like order, right? But like as these memories arise, right? And so I wanted to give the reader that experience of like living this life, but not living this life like marching through every century, like this like, you know, in an order, but rather like the way you would experience the past in your life. So.
It's kind of about time.
Yeah.
And time isn't always, in our experience, chronological.
Well, it's never chronological.
I think.
Yes.
A few questions kind of about your writing and the way you write. First of all, I really appreciate that you're absolutely brilliant, and the way that you're writing, you bring in, it doesn't feel like you're being lectured to or being learned or talked down to. And there's so much, at least I found so much, in the novels that I've read, that you've written, that I've loved. Do you do a draft first? How many edits do you do before you get there? And is your intent to teach somebody who's not as learned as you? I mean, I'm learning all this stuff that, as I was reading, I didn't realize that it was all connected to the Torah and your experience there. It's just, so I gotta tell you, I'm more impressed now than I was before I came.
If only my children were this impressed with me.
I'll write them a note.
It's like, not so much now. No, not at all. Thank you. I don't write these books to teach, I write these books to learn. Right? Like, I mean, because I'm writing the story, like, I want to know something.
So you're basically...
Yeah, like I'm writing it to learn myself. Like that's why I'm writing it. And you know, when I say to learn, I don't mean like to go do a research project on Yochanan ben Zakkai. I mean like there's a question that's bothering me. So like with this book, I was thinking, I spoke a little bit in my, formal remarks about like sort of how I came to this, but like actually, I thought of the idea for this book in the shower because, actually my husband gave me a gift for Mother's Day several years ago of a waterproof pad and pencils that are in my, it's the only place in my house where no one bothers me, right? There's 4 children. So like, that's the only, and sometimes they even bother me there. So it's like, that's the only place where no one's bothering me. And I had this idea in my head, I mentioned I like to like have a challenge for myself. And I didn't specifically set the challenge like I wanted it to be one character. I hadn't thought of it that far, but I knew I wanted to do something simple, which you read this book and you're like, well, you didn't succeed. No, I didn't. I'm not good at that. What I mean by simple is like, I wanted to do something where, if you've read Kafka's Metamorphosis, it's like, it's all like a normal world and like everything is the same, except the guy turns into a bug. Well, right, he turns into a bug, but otherwise everything is exactly the, it's like he's a bug who's worried about going to work, right? So it's like everything is the same except this, you change one thing, just one thing. So this was my idea, and I'm always, as I said, I'm always like thinking of these Torah verses, and I was in the shower, and I was thinking about, there's many passages in the Torah that start with the phrase Eila Toldot and then someone's name, which means it's usually translated as like these are the generations of somebody, and it's like that's always when it follows like with this like long like list of people begatting each other. You know, it's like the genealogies, and it's like, you know, they're always guys. It's always like this, you know, Eila Toldot, you know, Eila Toldot Noah. It's always like, you know, Noah or Jacob, and it's like it's like this guy begat this guy begat this guy, and I was like, you know, I've begat people. Just didn't really seem like a very masculine experience to me when I did it. And I was just sort of thinking about that in the shower, and I'm like, it's so weird that it's like always these guys begatting each other. And, you know, and I just wrote on this pad, and I wrote it in Hebrew because this is the way I was thinking it. I wrote, Eila Toldot Rachel. Right? These are the generations of Rachel. So Rachel is, and it's actually this week's Torah portion, which I'll be reading on Saturday. This week's Torah portion is where, you know, Rachel is the, you know, one of the four matriarchs, but she is initially is infertile, right? And she is the one she says to Jacob, her husband. She says, you know, give me children or I will die. Right? This is in the parsha this week, and then there's this beautiful verse in the book of Jeremiah, so hundreds and hundreds of years later, where it's talking about the people being brought into exile when they were conquered by Babylonia. It's the first temple is destroyed, and it talks about how as they're leaving for Babylonia, they're going past, Rachel's the only person who, of the patriarchs and matriarchs, who's not buried in this cave of Machpelah. She dies in childbirth, so her give me children or I will die, or it's more of an and than a or. And she dies in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. Joseph and Benjamin are her biological children. And she dies giving birth to Benjamin. She dies on the road. And she's buried in a place called Ramah. And in Jeremiah, he has this beautiful line where he says that as the people are leaving Jerusalem, they're passing, or the captives are being held and then taken past Rachel's tomb. And there's this verse he has where he says, a voice is heard in Ramah. And it's Rachel Imenu, right? It's Rachel weeping for her children, and she cannot be comforted because her children are no more. And I just thought that was such a beautiful idea that there's this idea of this mother who is always present, which I feel like is so many of our experiences of either being a mother or having one. Is this idea? This is someone who's always with you, even if they're, regardless of whether or not they're dead or alive, or whether you want them there or not, right? I mean, they're always there, right? And they're always sort of watching you. It's sort of, and I was like, that is sort of the idea of that immortal person, right? Is that eternal presence that's always watching you and thinking of you. So this is very far from your original question.
But no, but it's just what you do. You write the story, but there's some.
Yeah,
so
that was the question. Yeah, so I don't load this with facts. Right, I'm not looking to teach me. I'm looking to teach. It's for me to learn, right? It's not for. I'm not there to teach you. I'm doing this to learn, and then when I'm writing it, so you asked about editing. I mean, so it's really different with each book. So I've had books that where I had a lot of editing. I had 2 of my books where I wrote them in first person, and then I decided at the end, should it be better in third person? I had to go change every single sentence. Right, so...
Which ones?
What? No, you can't do that with autocorrect. No, because even if you could just replace... first of all, you can't, and second of all, even if you could, it changes the whole book, because suddenly it's you don't have to just write about what that person would have noticed, right? It's you walk into a room, it's not just his point of view, it's you can talk about all kinds of other things, right? It totally changes the whole story. So I had a book, my second book, The World to Come. My first draft of that book was 700 pages long. There were it was about a family with 5 siblings. I got rid of 3 of the siblings. I was so sad. Oh, they're dead. Goodbye. I killed those people. I had to finish that book is now it's maybe 280 pages, but it was originally 700 pages. So there's books that my first book I added 100 pages. So it's there's usually a lot of editing. This book, I wrote it straight through, and I was like, I really feel like I'm not done. And I was just hitting a wall because I was like, I don't really know what to change or what would be bad, make it better. I didn't really have a sense. And so I sent it to my editor, who I've actually been very fortunate. I've had the same editor for all of my books. And I sent it to her, and something bizarre happened, which is like she read it and wrote back to me. She says, "This is perfect, I have no changes."
Wow. That's incredible.
Well, I didn't believe her. So, then I gave it to a friend who, read through it. I changed, but I didn't change anything big. Like even with my friend who read through it, I changed there's some details, conversations, or small changes. So this book, I didn't change anything.
And to me, they didn't seem, there's no formula.
No.
So
Which
each
is
of
why
the
it's like
books I
terrifying.
found has been very different.
Yeah, well, exactly, because I'm easily bored, so I don't like doing the same thing again and again. And also, but it also makes it very terrifying. Like right now, you're all gonna be like, "What are you doing next?" And my answer is, I have no idea. I have no idea. Like right now, I'm working on a few different things that are none of which are actually a book. Like I had an idea for a TV show, so I wrote a TV show. And whether it ever gets made is a different question, but I wrote a TV show because I had an idea for a TV show. My son and I are developing a board game. I created a board game. I just took a commission to do a graphic novel. I'm not going to draw it, I'm working with an artist. So, and I have an idea for that. So that I sort of, because it's with an artist, I have to plan a little. Probably not as much as the artist will want me to plan. So I'm working on other, and eventually this will lead me back to writing a novel, but I'm terrified of writing another novel. I'm always terrified of writing another novel. I have no idea what I'm doing. Yes?
One of my favorite parts of the book was where you talked about the change between a scroll, sort of the technology of books and how they've evolved and how important it was that you were able to, or you were forced to read every word in a scroll. And now you get to a book and you can skip around and read the last chapter and skim through it. Can you talk more about that and what you think about kind of the future of now that we're back to scrolling?
Well, yeah, now we are back to scrolling has returned, which is so weird. Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think because I have this perhaps outsized historical consciousness all the time, I always am noticing things that people think are new that are not new. So one of my favorite texts that I remember reading in graduate school was, Phaedrus, this one of the Socratic dialogues, where Socrates is going on and on about how there's this new technology that's destroying civilization, and it's called writing. Because, now that people can write things down, it will destroy memory. Because, who's going to memorize the epics of Homer anymore? True. No one memorizes the epics of Homer anymore, right? I mean, and you also don't memorize your best friend's phone number anymore, right? There's yes, that is absolutely, he was right about that, right? But I don't think any of us are going to be like, oh, writing destroyed civilization, right? I mean, it's very, all technologies have these like gains and losses, right? And so that's why, yeah, I included that part about the scroll to the book, right? Because so this is, she talks about how like, she always thought like it was so stupid when we moved from scroll to book, right? This is like, how when you read a scroll, you can't like skip to the interesting part, right? I mean, you can't like skip around. You can't be like, oh wait, what happened in chapter 2? Let me go back and check, right? You can't like be like, oh, I only want to read chapter 12. You don't want to be like, oh, let me skip to the end. I'm going to only read the fun parts. Whereas like a book, you can do that really easily. And so it's sort of very much like, of course now you would say like, like reading stuff on the internet is like this stupid way of reading where you're just jumping around and it's like it's reduction of our, I just don't believe that like our civilization is in constant decline because of technology. Like I think it's absurd. So, but I think that, I think that I feel very fortunate to be part of a tradition where I still get to read from a scroll, right? And I still get to also, who's going to memorize the epics of Homer? Well, I could stand here and recite to you Book of Genesis in Hebrew with the Trop. Right, you know what I'm saying? Like, and even though I'm alive a lot later than Socrates, right? But that's because of this particular tradition, right? I mean, that's a very unusual thing that I have the ability to do that. So, I'm very much in favor of technology. So you said I'm like, well, again, there was like an anti-Silicon Valley bit in there. I mean, I just, I don't believe, I do think that actually like all these, I don't hate all these people who are like working on life extension because I do think like they won't end up defeating death, but like, you know, if they end up defeating Alzheimer's, like I have no problem with that. Like I am okay with like putting Alzheimer's out of our lives. Yes.
A few years ago, I had the opportunity to intern as a Jewish storyteller and got turned on to the narrative of Sarah Bat Asher, which is the story of
Eternal
Jacob's
lady.
granddaughter who manages to live more or less forever.
Yes.
And I was curious, you know, how much that was influencing your work with this novel.
Not a lot. I mean, I knew about it, but I don't. She lives long. She lives a very long life, but she's still alive when they leave Egypt, right?
And then
So.
she shows up in Rabbi Akiva's classroom.
Yes, yeah, she does. That's true. Yeah, no, I knew about her. I did think about that a little bit. Yes.
There are a number of long-living women.
Right.
Isn't Devorah, the nurse of Rivka, living for a very long time as well?
Yeah. Well, this one though is like that's the closest you come in Jewish tradition to like someone who's really like
that she like.
living forever. Yeah. That's an amazing character. Yes.
So I was thinking how one of the things that I felt the main character kind of lost as she lived longer was this like element of she was daring in the beginning part of her story. You know, she starts altering her father's scrolls. She's sneaking out to meet her love even though it's forbidden, or at some, you know, her, and I didn't feel, I'm curious where that part of her personality, does it shift because she's living longer? Does it shift because just time and her circumstances or culture has changed? I didn't see that element of like mystique and kind of pushing the boundaries within her own life. Where does that transpire throughout the story?
Yes. So yes, the character. So for people who haven't read the book, the character is she is like a little bit daring as a young woman, like at the beginning, before she becomes immortal, I should say, right? She's always a young woman, so, right? So she is very daring, right? And that's how she gets involved with this man in the first place. And she's also, yeah, her father's a scribe, and she's altering his scrolls. Later, she can't be daring because she has all these children, and she has too much to lose. You know, there's a later development in the story, and I don't think this is giving too much away. It probably becomes clear about halfway through the book. But you know, at some point it becomes clear to you as the reader, but also to her during the course of her life that she can't share with anyone that she's immortal because it puts other people in danger. So I won't go into too much detail about that. But that's like, you know, there's a reason why she can't like share this with people. But I think that sort of lack of daring, I think that's something I think is inspired by being a parent, because, you know, it's like like if I were 20 years old and didn't have kids, maybe I would be okay with like going skydiving. Like I would not go skydiving now, right? You know, I mean, do I know people who go skydiving? Yes, but it wouldn't be something. I mean, I think I've become less adventurous because I feel I have more to lose, right? Yeah, and so I don't know, you know, because there have been people who've noticed that too, and are like, you know, isn't it kind of the opposite? Don't people start out more timid and then become more bold as they get older? I'm like,
she got tired.
She gets tired. She does get tired. Yeah.
She lights herself on fire. That's pretty.
But when
She lights herself on fire. Well, that's true.
when you get older, you'll
Yes.
do risky stuff.
What about the imagery of the tunnels? Which, again, for people who haven't read the book, I don't want to give away too
That's
much,
okay.
but she always meets Eleazar.
Yes. Yeah, so there's, part of the book takes place in Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem, right? Which I know probably people in this room, some of you have been there. This is like, it's a 3,000-year-old tunnel where it was carved by King Hezekiah to protect the city's, Jerusalem's water supply from siege. And you can go there today as a tourist, actually. You know, there's water still flowing through it, and you walk through this tunnel that they carved through rock. So this was an image I chose, and it does appear several times, right? So she meets him in tunnels at various points. Well, there's one piece of it is that there's a rabbinic legend that when Jews of the diaspora die and when they're buried in the diaspora, that when the Messiah comes, they will travel through underground caverns to Jerusalem when the Messiah arrives. So that was one piece of it. But of course, there's a physical tunnel. You know, but to me, that tunnel is, you know, it's a real archaeological place, but to me, it's also like, it's a kind of an archaeology of the soul, right? Because I think that we all go through our daily lives, like always thinking about today and tomorrow and next week and next year, and during all this time we grow and we change and we age and we very rarely notice it. But I think we all feel that sort of current that's flowing right beneath the surface, right? And it's a current of days flowing out of our lives, right? It's often filled with sorrow and regret and loss. But at the same time, like this water supply in Jerusalem, it's like this is the only thing that keeps us alive and makes our lives worth living, is this current of loss, right? And there's that, there's one of the characters in the book is a gene therapist, right, or a genetic researcher who's working on this immortality, this life extension research. And there's one point where she's at like a school event for one of her young children, and she starts crying, that this he's growing up so fast kind of thing. And but one of the things she says is like, I feel like that's what I'm doing in my work, is I feel like even these happy moments have this undertow of sadness. And there's like, she says this to her grandmother, who she thinks is 85, but is really 2085. And she says, I feel this current of sadness below all these things that should be happy things. And this is why I'm doing this work. She says, because I feel like if I could just fix this problem, then all of these happy things would really just be happy, and we wouldn't feel this sadness anymore, this tunnel of sadness flowing through everything. And then her grandmother says to her, you need that tunnel, right? And she says, life doesn't mean anything without it. So, so to me, this is it's like an archaeology of the soul. Yes.
So I think there's an important distinction between indefinite life and eternal life. Because I think your character, Rachel, has eternal life. Like, she can't die no matter how hard she tries, and she definitely tries. But I think what futurists are talking about when they talk about immortality is indefinite life, which is just this idea of like, well, why should there be a predetermined time limit on your life? Like, why should you have to die after X years? And it's kind of like they see it as one of those things, like, we don't really accept that we just have to die of like polio, for example. So it's like a time limit on the human lifespan is just something that we don't have to accept necessarily. So I think it's just important to distinguish between not having to die and being forced to live forever. I think those are two different things.
Yes, well, so and I know this because all these futurist people, like, they write to me all the time. Some of them hate me. Some of them are cool. Some of them kind of don't like me at all. But some of them are okay. And yes, this is a distinction, right? It's right. It wouldn't. They're not looking for a world where it's impossible to kill yourself if that's what you chose to do. But I think that what she is saying, what she is experiencing in her life, though, is more about wondering what life is for, right? And there's actually the other character, you mentioned Sarah Ben Asher. There's another character who was more in my mind writing this, which I did include in the book, which is Honi the Circle Maker, right? So this is a story, I put it into the book. So it's like, if you've never heard the story, if you read the book, you'll now know the story. This is the one, this is like the Jewish Rip Van Winkle. This is the guy who's like, he sees a guy planting a carob tree. And he says, well, what's the point of planting a carob tree? Because it doesn't bear fruit for 70 years. And he says, you're not going to see this tree bear fruit. And he says, well, I came into the world with fully grown carob trees. And so my parents planted for me, I'm going to plant for my children. And then Honi does this Rip Van Winkle thing where he falls asleep and he wakes up 70 years later and he sees somebody harvesting this carob tree. And he goes, oh, did you plant this tree? And he goes, no, my grandfather did. And that's like usually where the story, people stop telling it, because then it's like a nice story about environmental sustainability. But actually, which it is, but then things get really dark, because if you keep reading the story after that point, Honi's like, cool, I slept through 70 years, let's see how things are going. And then he goes back to his house and you know, like his children are all dead, and like his grandchildren are there, and they've like kind of heard about him, but they like are like, who the heck are you? Like, go away, crazy man, pretending to be my grandfather. And then he goes to this academy where he used to teach, and you know, people are still like talking about, you know, the well-known Honey's ideas, but it's like, you know, when he goes in, he's like, I'm Honey, and that's not what I meant, and I meant that. They're all like, go away, crazy old man. And then he asks God to kill him. So this would be to your point about, you know, the futurists, right? He asks God to kill him. And the reason he does this is because he is become superfluous, right? So this is where I sort of, you know, and you're right that it's a distinction between, you know, wanting, you know, feeling like you've accomplished everything and that you get to choose how long you get to live. It's not the same as saying that like you could never die. But what I think that it sort of, that story really highlights is this idea that, in a sense, like one of the goals of being alive is to, like one of the goals of our lives is to make ourselves superfluous, right? Like that's like a life well lived is a life where what you give whatever it is that you have to offer the world, and you've given that to such an extent that people who you've given it to can do it for you, right? Like your ideas or your thoughts or your whatever it is that you have to give to the world, it's like you have been able to transmit that to other people in such a way that you're no longer needed, right? Like that's like what we describe as a life well lived. So, but yeah, these futurist people, they write to me all the time. Thank you so much for coming out in this horrible weather.
So, signing, anybody who wants to sign the book?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Provide a book.